just
Do
falling
you
over.
want to tell a story? Do you want me to get in there?
No. I set that for another day. We'll shoot down our watches. I do have a couple of quick stories, though. I was flying this aircraft, both on active duty, in Korea and in Germany. And then I got to fly it for a museum for about 15 years as a volunteer, taking it to air shows all over the place. This was taken up at Oshkosh. Again, we're talking about canopy opening. In front of 600,000 of my closest friends at 200 feet, doing a flyby at Oshkosh, following all the other warbirds. This canopy, which opens up to the side, departed the aircraft with a very loud bang, because now I've got this turboprop and a propeller right by our heads. We're wearing helmet, flight suit, boots and gloves, and live ejection seats, the whole bit, and it was so loud we could not communicate even amongst ourselves, let alone with anyone else. But the airplane kept flying. This thing had, the hinge basically failed, had structural failure on the bottom on the hinge. It's an old airplane. But nonetheless, when it departed, it hit the tail and still kept flying. I felt it, certainly felt it, and hear it, and guy in the right seat, everything, every paper clip, every little piece of fob, every piece of paper that was ever in that aircraft, even at 200 feet, we're doing about 240 knots, went flying out and right through our faces and out the aircraft. And if you're wearing eyeglasses, they probably would have gone too. So something to think about that. Just because the door opens in flight, it's awkward, inconvenient, distracting, but manage the distraction. It should not be a fatal event. And frankly, in this particular case, I transmitted a blind, said, I've got an emergency. I'm heading out over the water. In case the airplane did start to disintegrate, we're going to eject over Lake Winnebago. Turned out, okay, still flying. Come back around, land. Just did a 180, landed on 27. Said, I don't really want or need, I would like to have, but I don't need light gun signals. They gave me a light gun signal, gave a wing rock, land without incident. Doesn't have to be a big deal. But think about, just kind of the planning. If you can share fly some of these things, so what would I do if? Probabilities are low, but they can still happen. And if you have thought it through in advance, maybe it just help you in a situation with something that's most unusual and can be very distracting. But anyway, it's fun that you wouldn't bring that up. Say, that actually happened to me. So anyway, good evening. My name's Ed Finnigan. I'm a designated pilot examiner. I'm also what's called a specialty aircraft examiner. So in essence, I'm going to talk to you about warbirds and what it takes to fly a warbird, what exactly is a warbird, and the history of the whole program. Let's see if I can grab this pointer without putting my eye out. All right. That is a Grumman OV-1 Mohawk, made in 1964. As I said, I flew that very machine both in Korea and Germany, and then flew it all over the States doing air shows. All right, this is what we're going to talk about. What is the experimental aircraft program, the history of it, what is an aircraft, experimental aircraft examiner, and if you want to fly a warbird, what do you have to do, what do you have to have? And then I'll talk about at the end here, should give some photos. Oops, see, I already screwed it up. I think it's that one, this thing. Ooh, getting some nice photos. All right, basically what flying a warbird, they want the FAA their intent is to standardize the whole pilot program, the training program, the qualifications, they want to make it as much as like getting qualified in general aviation aircraft as possible. All right, what does it cover? Experimental, when I made the slides, I'm thinking experimental exhibition. So we're not talking experimental amateur home build. We're talking, in all cases here, experimental exhibition aircraft. So I should have put that on here, so my apologies. Turbine powered, turboprop, as well as turbojet. Any experimental exhibition aircraft, maximum gross weight of excess of 12,500 pounds. I'll give some examples of that a little bit later on. And aircraft over 800 horsepower, faster than 250 knots. That's basically what this covers. The history of the program was started basically right after World War II, and after all the conflicts, you have surplus vintage military aircraft. People want to fly them. They're buying P-51s, B-25s, TBM Avengers, B-17s on the surplus market. You know, buy it for the fuel inside, or oh, if only if I had the opportunity to buy one for a few $100s. But the program was administered by the local FSDOs. It was not a national project at all, or program. And at the time, it's just a minor detail because this is no longer used, but that's what they were using. They issued LOAs, letter of authorizations, you got from your local FSDO, or a letter of operational authority, which basically meant that you were authorized to instruct in that particular warbird. And maybe you were qualified in more than one warbird, so perhaps you would be authorized to instruct in each warbird that you flew. That doesn't mean that you were a CFI. It just meant you had experience in that aircraft and were allowed to instruct in it. There was no oversight, there was no consistency, there was no control. Nobody had any idea who had what, who was really qualified in what, and shopping, in quotes. If you don't like the answer you got at one FSDO, well, you just go to another FSDO, and how well can you sell yourself? In essence, I'm not one for government intervention. The program was a mess, and the accident rate reflected it. It was a total mess. So in 2003, 2004, they changed that. They basically nationalized the program and started a whole new process. Now, letters of authorization are still available, but they're used on a very limited basis. And it's mostly, for an applicant, and even though they may have more than one seat in the aircraft, you only have one pilot station, and that individual would be issued a letter of authorization to practice for their practical test. So it's still available, but its use is somewhat limited now. Oh, I have just had a thought, but I think I have a photo or a slide about that a little bit later on. All right, so everybody who had a letter of authorization to fly an aircraft or operational authority, they were converted to an authorized experimental aircraft endorsement on their airman certificate. Now, at the time, they wanted to call them an experimental aircraft authorization. They got a lot of pushback from the folks up at Oshkosh, because that's really what it is. It's an experimental aircraft authorization. However, experimental exhibition. So they said, no, we can't use EAA. So they authorized experimental aircraft by the specific, I hate to use the word type, so don't think of type ratings, but it's an endorsement for each experimental aircraft, like for L-29 as an example, or L-39 or T-28. All right, the airmen had to provide documentation. They had to prove they actually flew the aircraft. And that caused a whole lot of consternation for a lot of the senior old guard, because they got their LOAs at the pub. Well, I don't really need them. I don't really need to fly a P-51 to get an authorization to fly P-51, do I? You've got a B-25. I want a P-51. We can take care of this over a couple of drinks, like gentlemen. And again, the accident rate reflected that. So they actually had to prove they had time and training in the aircraft. All right, so examiners. When they started the program in 2004, they wanted to have it reflect ATP practical test standards as much as possible. In fact, that was the standard they're using the ATP practical test standards. That was tantamount to wearing a rented tux at a formal engagement. It works for the short term. The shoes just don't fit quite right. This cummerbund, this thing, it's just, if we needed our own practical test standards. But for several years, we were using the ATP practical test standards as our guide and as our standards. So, if you're going to have ATP practical test standards, you need to have a cadre of instructors. But then you also need to have a cadre of examiners. So that's where I came in. They, in 2003, 2004, asked if I'd be interested in the program. Okay. Well, little did I know how that was going to go. But nevertheless, we do experimental exhibition aircraft. Since that time, now I've expanded into doing general aviation DBE work, so it's gotten a whole lot more involved than when we first started out. There are several, basically now specialty aircraft examiners, warbird examiners throughout the country, and that number is growing slowly. We could use a few more. We've been petitioning the National Program Office out of Oklahoma City. So I'm actually considered a national asset, or you can delete that somewhat, national something. But we don't work for the local FSDO. Much to the annoyance of the local FSDO, I don't answer to them at all. I work for AFS, or actually, yeah, we used to be AFS, they keep changing their names. Doesn't really matter. AFG 970, I work out of Oklahoma City. I don't work for Great Lakes or for Milwaukee or whomever. And I actually don't work for them either. I work under their supervision. It's a better way to say that. We answer directly to the program office, and we can provide that again later. But if you want to get involved looking for a warbird examiner, you can go straight to that website. I checked it. It worked the last time I checked a couple of days ago. And there's a whole listing of all the warbird examiners and where they are in the country and what they're qualified in. All right, mentioned this endorsement before. Operating aircraft limitation. Now, I'm not that familiar, I'll readily admit, I'm not that familiar with experimental amateur home build, but I would assume that you have operating limitations for an amateur home build aircraft. Is that correct? Operating limitations? We have the same for experimental exhibition. Operating limitations, say before they can access pilot command, you can read this, I'm going to read it for you. Okay. Standard category, the whole qualification is, now we're using, instead of the ATP practical test standards as our standards and as our guides, we're using FAA order 8900.1, volume 5, chapter 9, section 2. Oftentimes we shorten that up to say, 592. I helped write this document. We now have our own standards for warbirds. I'm not wearing somebody else's tux. I'm wearing my own shoes, my own gloves, my own belt. It works much better for us. We actually helped write the document. And source for that also, we can put this up again later. You can go directly to that website and it gives you exactly that. How do I get qualified in a warbird? Meet the prerequisites in 592. They are clearly listed. I'll go into that. I have listed here. Okay, receive and document ground and flight training. A quick aside, I was doing a practical test in Grand Haven, Michigan on a T-28. I knew the instructor, did not know the applicant, knew the instructor, and the instructor is an excellent instructor, good pilot, good guy. His paperwork stinks. And his paperwork for this applicant was abysmal. His documentation was a mess. And unfortunately, I've got 2 FAA representatives, aviation safety inspectors from the local FSDO who want to observe, well within their rights to do so. We had to terminate the practical test because the documentation was insufficient. That did not certainly please the applicant. You cannot proceed. No matter how good you think you are, if your paperwork stinks, you stink. That's the way the FAA looks at it, and that applies to me and it applies to all the instructors out there. Operating limitations, AMPs, if your paperwork stinks, you stink. You got to document it correctly every time. Complete 8710-1, pretty much the same as any kind of general aviation credential, and then pass the practical test, both the ground evaluation, oral, and the flight test, to the standards we have already articulated in 592. All right, so now let's just give a few specifics. For an L-39 or L-29, basically turbine aircraft, least private pilot, category and class, third class medical, and an instrument rating. The reason for the instrument rating, that if you're going to be flying an L-39, L-29, T-33, and you're never going to go above 18,000 feet, you're lying. Because that's where the aircraft should be operating at the higher altitudes. you need to, that's positive control airspace, you need to have an instrument rating. So we included it there. You also have to log 1,000 hours, including 500 BIC in aircraft category. And then again, complete the training of 592. So there's a few requirements for the jets, in essence.
Is the medical still required as a third class, or can you fly it in basic?
Right here.
12,000.
I believe you need,
12.5,
yeah.
And the 250 knots.
Yeah, and that is coming up here with the, like a T-28. Pilot certificate, third class medical. My guidance has been in specific cases, case by case basis on the basic med. Because I've had a couple, specifically one was a T-28, and I called and asked, we talk about, third class medical, but this gentleman has basic med, has never been denied a medical. And he said that was acceptable. It's a changing, dynamic world all the time, so I can't emphatically say yes or no. However, here we have complex and high power endorsements. 50 hours complex, 500 hours, so it's not the 1,000 hours, lower the time. You stand, again, training requirements of 592. The authorization is listed on the airman's certificate. And this is what I was going to say, I have a slide for this later. It is awarded as an authorization, as an endorsement. It is not a type rating. And I have actually seen in EAA Warbirds of America magazine advertisements for earn your experimental type rating with us. There is no such thing. That should never be there, and I just cringe every single time. I wish we could call it that, but there is no experimental type rating. Now here's where it does get a little confusing. There are warbird aircraft that are type certificated. You get a type rating for those aircraft. A couple examples would be a Grumman TBM Avenger, maybe the B-17, B-25. Depends how the paperwork is for that aircraft. If the aircraft is certificated in the standard category, has a type certificate data sheet, you get a type rating for that aircraft, you don't get an endorsement. If the B-25, for example, is certificated in experimental exhibition, then you get the endorsement. You do not get a type rating. You get authorized experimental aircraft, North American B-25.
Is that endorsement on your certificate or
Yes.
in your logbook?
It is on your certificate. It was actually on your certificate. And below the limitations section. Now, all these different types of warbirds, get ready, here gets really fun stuff. Separated into 10 groups, and the groups are defined by aircraft description. Group 1. Do I need to explain what this is? No. Thank you. Single engine, conventional landing gear, straight wing. That's an example of it. Look at the lines on that baby. Ooh. There's group 2. Single engine, tricycle landing gear, straight wing. Group 3. Multi-engine, 2 engines. Well, this aircraft depends, I have both the endorsement for the B-25 as well as the type rating for the B-25. It is not a two-way street. If you had gotten trained and did your practical test in an experimental exhibition B-25, you get the endorsement. That means you can only fly B-25s that are in the experimental exhibition category. If you got a type rating in a B-25 that's in the standard category with the type certificate data sheet, then you can fly either one. So if you have your B-25 certificate and then you've got a type rating, and your friend over there says, can you fly my B-25? You don't have to ask how the paperwork is. You just say, I can fly it as long as it's legal and safe, whether it's experimental or standard category. If you have a type rating in it, you can go fly. If you have experimental exhibition, authorized experimental endorsement, then you need to only be able to fly experimental exhibition aircraft. It used to be a two-way street. About 2 years ago, the FAA tightened up on that, and it's no longer a two-way street. All right, group 4. The British make some ugly airplanes, but I understand Lancaster was a great flying machine. But it's multi-engine, more than 2 engines. Shackleton has 6, but the group is multi-engine, whether it's conventional gear or tricycle gear, more than 2 engines. Group 5, we're talking now the turbojets. Straight wing, single engine turbojet. Good examples, T-33. P-80, another example. OB-1 Mohawk, turbine or turbojet powered. So turboprops fit into that multi-engine. This aircraft is one of the, many people have said, one of the ugliest airplanes they've ever seen. Let me tell you, it's ugly till you fly it. I've flown a whole, I need to count. I honestly don't know how many different types of airplanes I've flown. This is one of the best handling airplanes I've ever flown. It will out-turn, out-climb, out-dive any World War II fighter that I've ever encountered. Now, granted, P-51s, Corsairs, others, P-39, or P-63 really, all they do is wing level, flat out, and they can outrun me. But they cannot out-turn, out-dive, or out-climb. And I've been jumped by many, many folks going, we're going to have some fun with it. And suddenly, within half a turn, I'm behind them in a position to fire. And they're like, well, what happened? It's not the aircraft. It's knowing your airplane, knowing your limitations, knowing what you can do and what you can't. But that, people say, what an ugly airplane, until you fly it.
What is it?
That's a Grumman OV-1 Mohawk. It was originally designed under a joint Marine and Army contract in '59. Okay. And it was intended to be used perhaps by the Marines on the carriers. And then the Marines backed out of the project and the Army kept it. They used it extensively in Vietnam. You could put machine gun pods to remove these fuel tanks. You could put machine gun pods, rocket pods underneath there, and it was a very effective ground support type of ground attack aircraft. And then the Air Force found out that the Army was arming fixed-wing airplanes in Vietnam, and it turned into a big political dust-up. So we removed all the weapons and put on surveillance gear. This particular pod here and there is an overgrown radar detector. We could pick up the radar signatures of surface air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery with great accuracy. And we'd be able to follow the enemy, or the bad guys as we call them, by their electronic signature. So used all the way up into even in the Gulf War. We lost 2 aircraft. The mission they were doing was so important, they purposely ran them out of fuel because they had no other assets that could collect the data that they were collecting. They also could put a big radar pod here. They had cameras you put in the nose, here in the belly, and then farther back too. So it did infrared work, photographic work, day or night, side-looking airborne radar, electronic intelligence. When we're flying this, I had a sensor operator who would operate all the equipment in the right seat. They all had 1 set of flight controls. So I did all the talking, all the flying, all the navigating. 2 tactical FMs, 2 UHFs, 2 VHFs, and an HF. And we're using them all at once. So you need to have a grease pencil so you can keep track of what frequencies you're on and who you're talking to. All right, digressing a little bit. Here's Group 7, swept wing, subsonic, single engine. MiGs, Sabres. Nice flying aircraft, actually. Supersonic, for those who have lots and lots of fuel money. Lots of fuel money. And even more fuel money. One of these at Oshkosh, more than 10 years ago. I think it was the Collins Foundation, the F4 on takeoff roll. Canopy blew off that too. So we're talking about canopy, the rear canopy blew off on takeoff roll at Oshkosh. I think it was takeoff roll. All right, Group 10. Go Army, B, Navy. Helicopters. Who can identify that helicopter? Good man, exactly. We'll just go UH-60. But you're right, yeah. A little trivia point. The reason that tail rotor is canted at a bit of an angle so that it fit inside a C5. And just fold the blades back and pull it right in, and tail rotor's canted just enough so it fits inside the C5. At least that's what I was told.
It was also for the original UTAS spec that gives you 400 pounds of lift. Sikorsky made the spec, and Boeing didn't. They were analyzing our aircraft, and they missed that little
Did they get, to me that looks like an airfoil. Did they get a coefficient of lift out of the whole fuselage shape, do you know?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. Because to me that looks very much like an airfoil.
It's designed to do the least amount of harm.
Yeah.
Any questions? I know I covered a lot of stuff very, very quickly, but I just didn't want to drag in too much detail, get down into the weeds too much. But the board happy to answer, any question anybody has. My contact information, have some cards. That's Stu Dawson up at Reno several years ago. And another fine piece of art.
So is
I wonder who owns that?
Who owns that? Well, I
I
don't
wonder
know.
who owns that.
I would either confirm or deny that that could be my aircraft.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
that could be. That could be.
How do you do a test in a longer, of course, they're single seat?
We would go up in a two-seater aircraft. I've had that argument with the local FSDO. They were saying, well, you have, let's use an example of like an A4. There is but one example of a two-seat A4, not even in this area. I think maybe in the country that was flyable. This was several years ago. And they said, well, that aircraft must be used. I said, whoa, 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 whoa. No, it does not need to be used. That must is not the correct word. They said, well, it's available. No, it's not available. It exists. Just because it exists does not mean it's available. As an example, you have a Maserati or a very exotic sports car. Well, I want to drive it. It exists, therefore it's available. I said, no, just because it exists does not make it available. So how would you do a practical test in a single pilot station aircraft? I could go flying, I could use a TBM Avenger as an example. There's only one set of flight controls. I can either ride along with no flight controls at all. That is at my discretion. Or we go fly in a two-seat aircraft, of which there are no dual-controlled TBM Avengers that I'm aware of. So the replacement for that would be T6. We go fly in a T6, perform all the maneuvers to standard. Then we get out of the T6. He climbs into the Corsair or P-51, what have you, or TBM Avenger, and I do a ground observe. Or I could stay in the T6 and we do the flight portion and I'm either following or I'm in formation. That is my least favorite because the probability of us miscommunicating and having a mid-air is very high. So what I usually do is we will have the ground eval based on the aircraft in question, then pre-flight the aircraft obviously, and then we go fly in a T6. He performs all the maneuvers as standard. We get out of the T6, he climbs into the aircraft in question, and I do a ground observe. And that has been the way it's been done since the 40s, so it has precedence. The local FSDO didn't like it, and I told them very candidly that I didn't care.
Hey, Ed, how about the training in a single seater where there's no twin or
The first time, yeah, you spend a lot of time on the ground, whether it's taxi runs, engine startups and shutdowns, cockpit familiarizations. Many times, the first time I actually ever flew the single seat aircraft, I was solo. So you spend a lot of time in the books, and oftentimes we do a blind cockpit check as well. You know, put a scarf or, cover up your eyes somehow, and the instructor will be right there and say, okay, touch the master switch, touch the flap handle, touch the gear handle, touch this, that. And if you miss one, you're not ready to go flying yet. So that's essentially a whole lot of training on the ground, but the flying for the applicants is first time they go flying, they're usually solo.
What about the documentation? I mean, you don't have your endorsement yet, I presume.
And that's where that letter of authorization comes in, where they are authorized to fly that aircraft for the purpose of practicing for the practical test. So that is it's not a workaround, but that's the way, the mechanism to be in compliance with their operating limitations. Usually the T6 is such a versatile aircraft that they'll do a lot of flying in the T6. Sometimes the instructor will be in the front seat and they'll have the applicant student in the back seat, flying the T6 from the back seat, and then they transition to Corsair as an example and do all the ground checks and all the cockpit checking and what have you, and systems training. And then the first time he flies it, he's solo. And that's kind of a humbling experience when you're taking off in this aircraft for the first time. And I've never flown it before, and it's worth about $4 or $5 million just because they came out of the restoration shop. Yeah, don't screw up. Yeah, well, that's how they did it in World War II. Okay, here's the manual. Read it. The morning you guys are ferrying 100 P-51s to the Soviet Union or something or other. Yeah, many times you'll learn your aircraft en route. And that's how they did it.
When they were 20 years old.
Yes, with about 200, maybe 250 hours total time.
Any questions for?
Yeah, any more questions? Yes, sir.
Do you care to comment on the impact on flight safety of the recent FAA workforce reduction?
As a matter of fact, in February, I attended the National Warbird Operators Conference, and usually the FAA or certain people in the FAA attend that from the National Program Office as well as on the aeromedical side, and all of their travel authorizations were yanked. A couple of them showed up anyway, just on their own, just because they're Warbird people and wanted to be there. And so, like most of these conferences, where is most business conducted? At the pub. That's normal. So we're standing there talking to a couple of the FAA folks who I consider friends, and I asked them off the record. I said, "What's really going on? How are things going for you?" And they were very discouraged. Right now, they're feeling really beat up, feeling pretty, I won't say abandoned. That word was not used, but they're feeling very alone and pretty discouraged right now. That's not the best way I can characterize it.
Anybody else?
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I do have some cards. You got any questions? You know what I'm saying? Sir?
Thank you. Great.